Good morning. In this video, I'm going to continue on the issue of slavery, Civil War, and the issues dealing with Max Powell and his other issues. First, let me say, I'm not mad at Max Powell. I still love him in the Lord. He's my brother in Christ. I still have a very high regard for him. So don't think because we're arguing about a point that this makes us, at odds with each other or, arguing. People can argue without disliking each other. I mean, that's just, we'll disagree on this issue and move on to something else. That's it, it's fine. No big deal. So don't let these, debates go back and, looking at these people and say, oh, when he outs or something. No, I regard him as a brother in Christ, love him in the Lord, and I have very high regard for his intelligence and his theological views. So he's just wrong on this issue. He's just wrong on this one. But also the fact is, this video, what I put in videos, it's not just about theology. I got people calling me, what are you doing about it? It's about learning to think. It's about learning how to think, people. And you see what happens, like in case of Max. Max is reading something, and he's reading what he wants to be there, and it's not there. And he sees immigrant, and he sees mercenaries. It's not mercenaries. And I think the problem is because he says these ethnic groups were formed as one unit. But that was just the tradition of those days. They would form units around one group. That Japanese had their own unit in World War II, the Nisi Brigade Battalion. The most highly decorated unit in World War II, by the way. So you form ethnic groups, and I think the Irish had their own group in World War I as well. So it's just a tradition people would have. The Army had it at certain times that they would form units around groups for to make them, solidity, and because they had a common link to each other. But they weren't mercenaries. They were people from in the United States who'd come to the United States, become citizens, and it actually says the article read the sons of immigrants, so some of those people were the sons of immigrants as well. But the idea is that, this is, and look at globalism. You can look at, you're calling Lincoln. You can't go, Lincoln was a Hamiltonian. You have to look at the Hamiltonian versus Jefferson argument. Hamiltonian was for a strong central government. Jefferson was for a weak central government. And Hamilton believed debt was good. Jefferson believed debt was bad. On the issue of monetary policy, Jefferson was correct versus Hamilton. We should have hard money. That's what the Democrats originally took, was hard money. Putting everything in gold, and the Hamiltonians put a central bank and expanded credit, and they used that to have the internal improvements, and that's essentially what the Whig Party was about, which Lincoln was a part of. But that doesn't mean they were right about slavery. Slavery was the one of the dividing issues that the Republican Party was formed to stop the expansion of slavery. That became the focal point in the 1840s, between 1840 and 1860. And that's context. And that's one thing we learn reading the Bible. You have to have context. Everything's context. And you have to understand your context. Max Powell he's making a comment back to somebody on my page there, and he says he's refuting the idea that the war was entirely about slavery. No one ever said the war was entirely about slavery. That's a straw man. That's a straw man that Max is trying to set up. The war was essentially about slavery, ultimately about slavery, because the South viewed it as a crucial issue, and they seceded. Not only did they secede from the United States, they seceded from their own party. They broke the party up, and Douglas believed the Democrats could have won the White House had the two parties stayed aligned. I mean, the regions, the Northern and Southern Democrats. But Southern Democrats refused to stay with Northern Democrats if the protection of the right to expand into new territories wasn't given as an absolute right. Douglas said it had to be left up to the voters. That was what the Lincoln-Douglas debates were about. Popular sovereignty versus the principles of Declaration of Independence, and the idea that slavery was going to be limited as an evil. You have to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, people. See what the issues what the Northern Democrats were for. Popular sovereignty. and the idea that the slavery could be taken anywhere, but based on the votes. The South wasn't having that either. The South said, no, we're viewing these as property. We're not voting on it. We're going to take it where we want. Now, those are facts. They're not opinions. They're facts. I'm sorry. I'm going to give you some books. Look at them. I mean, if you want to get into the issue, you want to find out, you know, if it matters to you. Or another brother up there talking about John Brown. And, you know, he was like a martyr or something. No, he wasn't. He was in John 15:13. No greater love. The man had this and he died for his neighbor. Well, no, he got other men killed. He got his sons killed, and he actually had an innocent black man killed. I think the first one killed was a black man. I think was at the army. I remember the case. Remember what happened. When you get innocent people killed, that's not martyrdom. Say what you do with your life is your business. When you bring innocent people into a situation, the blacks were not going to uprise. There was going to be no black uprising. And to think that you're going to grab an armory and you know, lead to this big uprising was ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. So no, he shouldn't be treated as some martyr that deserves to be honored because he got innocent people killed. You get innocent people killed for something that's ridiculous that can't work, like putting up a slave revolt. Then you know there's nothing you know to say about it. It's just you know you be off your rocker, and so he should not be honored as some great individual. And but that there was a reaction to the South then because they believed. By the way, he was denounced by the abolitionists, even though the abolitionists were responsible for arming them. Some of the abolitionists they had to flee. They fled. The guys who armed them with the rifles. Fearing the government was going to come and get him. But the abolitionist movement, it was really a black eye to the abolitionist movement because the abolitionist movement was always preaching peace. A peaceful resolution of the slave issue. And then this guy comes up and they played into the hands of the South who was saying that the North wanted to antagonize the South and get the slaves rising up and killing them, killing these people, white people in their sleep and stuff. And remember, they had the context in the Turner Rebellion that happened a couple of decades, I think, or before that. Context, people, context. You cannot get away from context what's going on. You cannot take things out of context. People are always living in context, in a certain environment. Same thing with World War II. World War II's brought up the Japanese, you know, and if FDR, you know, goaded them, Japanese into attacking. Yeah, he probably did go. He did go, and the isolation movement was viewing that as goading them. You know, we were sending land lease to the Germans. That thing was won by one vote. That's how strong the isolationist movement was in that day. Americans did not, and FDR was elected, like Wilson, by the way, in saying he would never go to war. He said, I'm not sending you guys over to war. Both Wilson and FDR, you know, were elected on that basis. But the fact of the matter is that the isolation movement, which was very strong, was destroyed, ended. Lindbergh, you know, the great pilot, you know, who crossed flew from the United States to France, you know, one without stopping. He was an isolationist, and so the isolation movement had a lot of pull, a lot of power. Americans didn't want to go to war. They had a lot of people in the Congress who were against going to war, and didn't want to support, you know, the British. You know, in that case, even they still voted to stay out of the war, even when the British were getting, you know, bombed in the Battle of Britain. But the real issue was, no matter how much the FDR goaded them, the issue is a sneak attack issue. If the Japanese had simply declared war on the United States, said, oh, we can't take your embargo anymore, we're going to declare war on the United States, there still would have been opposition to the war. But the sneak attack is what united people in the United States. The isolation movement was over. after that. They said, well, okay, this is such an abomination, infamy, that we're going to war over this. And so this issue that, yeah, what FDR did, but with the embargo, was irrelevant to the fact that the Japanese chose to negotiate and had their fleet coming in, knowing negotiations weren't going to work. They were not coming in to really negotiate. They were coming in to buy time in order to lull the Americans into an idea of peace. And then, of course, strike Pearl Harbor and hopefully get enough ground, do enough damage that the Americans would not have the determination to fight their way back and take everything back. The Japanese did believe that the United States would not have the heart to do that. But they underestimated the United States. They believed they would have the power, the industrial power. Yamamoto, the guy who authored the invasion, the Pearl Harbor attack, knew, because he spent a lot of time in the United States, he knew how powerful the United States was going to get in a war. He said, I got 6 months. After that, the United States will be way too powerful. But you can't take things out of context, people. So the purpose of this channel is always keeping understanding how to read the Bible in context and thinking correctly, avoiding fallacies, avoiding self-deception, avoiding, when you're reading something, read what's there, not what you think is there. Making sure that you have the correct definitions on things and you're not being emotional. So let me show you some here books. Here's a book we recently just began reading. Just really came out, The Armies of Deliverance. This author here points out that there were actually 3 basic reasons. And he says that the reasons for the war for the North was actually confusing. You had the Northern Democrats who just wanted to preserve the Union. You had the abolitionist side who wanted to end slavery, and then you had what she points here is another group that wanted to deliver the South from the oligarchy, the slave owners. And so it was a threefold coalition that was involved in keeping out and fighting a civil war. And Lincoln had a whole 3 parts together. So he had to be very careful not to balance either one out. The border states were fighting to preserve the Union. Kentucky and Maryland and these other states, they were crucial. Delaware, they were crucial, and they had slaves still. So, and the Northern Democrats, that was still in the area, up north. Their goal was to preserve the Union. They had no intention of ending slavery, and they voted against the 13th Amendment. But they were crucial in fighting the war. Versus the Copperheads. There's a group called the Copperheads who wanted to end the war, didn't think we should be fighting the war, and would have just surrendered any attempt to subdue the Confederate States. And they were inside the North, and they were basically 5th column guys. So the goals of the North were a lot more complicated. And they got 3 goals. That's why it's easy to pick out one and say this is this is it. The goals of the South were simpler. And what happened was the issue of the whites saying we're fighting to overturn the oligarchy that's in the South, the slave power. Was the fact that they underestimated how attached the whites were to that, to the Confederacy, thinking that they'd be welcome as liberators, and they weren't. But that they really were duped, even though they don't recognize it. Recognize the fact that these slave owners didn't care about they cared about their own power. They didn't care about their people. They were responsible for that war. They seceded, and they provoked the idea of secession and the issue of the war. I mean, 2 groups. One guys at one point out 2 groups that wanted secession: South Carolina and Massachusetts. They were most extreme groups. The abolitionists wanted to let the South secede. if you couldn't end slavery, they said, well, let the South go, rather than have expansion of slavery. South Carolina was always advocating for secession. Way back in Jackson's day, they were talking about doing the tariff issue, the nullification stuff. Here's the impending crisis, 1848, 1861, and by David Potter. Very good. Remember, everything has to be read in context between 1840. Yeah, you go further back, back to Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian states' rights versus federal government. But you really look at the core issues of 1840, 1860, the election of Lincoln, etc. The road to disunion. Okay, this goes to 1776, 1854. As I said, it gives you context back to 1776 to 1854. I mentioned last time about what was going on in the South during the war, and their political liberties is always talking about how Lincoln was terrible civil liberties. He was suspended by a bit of habeas corpus, those things. His Southern rights in the South, political prisoners, and the myth of Confederate constitutionalism. They act like the Confederates were upholding their Constitution. Jeff Davis did everything. Lincoln did it more. So the idea that Lincoln was some horrible tyrant because of what was going on in the war. Well, the Confederacy was a bastion of freedom, and they were keeping their upholding their Constitution is false. Here's what you can get an issue of the Confederate nation, exactly what was going on in the Confederate nation, how they lived, and there were issues. And 1860. Here's you want to talk about the issue of fate of liberty, and what was the issue of constitutional, how Lincoln had to deal with constitutional issues, and why he had to suspend a bit of habeas corpus a number of times. Dealing with Maryland, for instance, they always bring up Maryland. He had to keep Maryland, he had to keep Baltimore, so he could keep the be able to preserve Washington, D.C. So there were a number of cases why he was totally in his rights to do so as a rebellion. Arguing about slavery. This is an issue of the gag rule that came on Congress when the Southern power, the oligarchy, suppressed free speech in Congress, would not allow slavery to be brought up. They imposed the gag rule. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, had a fight against that. It went for about 10 years because there'd be people would address Congress. You have a right to make an address Congress, and they were not, and therefore they could be brought up and put into record books saying, stop slavery, end slavery. The Southerners were not allowed that, and so this is a whole issue of how that battle went back and forth in trying to free Congress. And this is why there was the view that the slave power was tyrannical. They said, not only these people keeping black people slaves, they're keeping white people slaves on the North. They said, this is the arrogance these people have. They think they can slave everybody. Again, context, people. You have to look at context, see what's going on. Not read something on the internet. Dred Scott's decision, one of the greatest decisions, great in a sense, the most important decisions that ever faced the nation, divided the nation. Said Dred Scott, at first they said they had no right to rule on it, then they ruled on it and said this is a black man saying he had a right to be free because he lived in a free state for a certain period of time. They came back, Taney, the chief of the Supreme Court, Southern, I think he's actually from Maryland, if you want to say Southern, he was from Maryland. And he said, no, not only, do you have no right to petition the court, but black men have no right to be citizens. And the Declaration of Independence only applied to the to white men. And there were a number of other crucial decisions. He basically said that the Southerners could take a black man anywhere they want to go. He basically overruled every compromise, Missouri Compromise, Kansas, Nebraska. He overruled all that and said the black man was property, and you could take him anywhere, anywhere he could go, that the southern side to go. So all these compromises were, because there's the idea that somehow slavery would be limited to certain areas. They, would not go. And the arguments was always that, well, slavery from the temperament, from the environment, could only go so far because there's no need, your West is just, what do you use slaves for? So it's just not an area for slavery. But the South wouldn't hold to that. They said, no, we have a right to take our quote unquote property wherever we want to go. And the North, of course, said, no, this is we have free states, and we're not going to allow slaves in these areas. And it went to Supreme Court, and Dred Scott overruled it and overturned every compromise on that issue. Here's the field of blood, violence in Congress, and the road to civil war. I mentioned that the issue is that things became so violent in Congress, in the Senate, in particular in the Senate, where these guys become armed to Congress. You think things are bad today. You think they're bad today. Guys become armed with pistols and Bowie knives. And this is a case where the guy basically, they were punching each other out. One guy was sitting at his desk, Sumner, and he was a congressman from Massachusetts. And the guy, congressman, the Senate from Massachusetts, and the senator from South Carolina, I think it's a junior senator, I think it was Hammond, comes over and just starts beating him with a cane. Beating him almost near that took him a year to come back. That's what and he got praised in the South for that. Praised because the idea that this guy suddenly got up there and tried to attack slave power, attack slavery. When you attack slavery, you attack the nobility of the South, and they took it. Oh, how dare you! You're insulting the South. And so these noble Christian gentlemen thought he had the right to go up and beat this guy almost to death. And that's only one of the cases. They basically said, they came to take him on. Then they were shooting each other and stabbing each other. And you want to read about it? Read about it. Read about it. You can't understand anything about context, people. What's going on? Here's slave states in the presidential election of 1860. Something interesting here that is reported here, talking about Douglas, the candidate that faced Lincoln in the Douglas debates and in the presidential. And, the Southern Democrats said, we're not going to stay with the Northern Democrats unless Douglas agrees to these demands. So he was asked about, on Lincoln's election, will the South be justified in seceding? 2, if South secede before an overt act of Lincoln, we would advise to vindicate resistance by force. To both questions, Douglas replied with unmistakable clarity. There was none of that tergiversation, I looked up if I know the words, of which he had so often been accused of in the past. Okay, I guess that's been wobbly. He'd always been wobbling back and forth on this issue and advocating for popular sovereignty. He answered at the first in the negative. No, secession was not legitimate, contending that a constitutional election could afford no justification for such action. That's a Democrat saying that, Northern Democrat, not a Republican. It was this reply to the second question that caused a sensation. The duty of the president was to enforce the laws to whom, if necessary, he pledged his aid. So there's a Northern Democrat saying, yeah, Lincoln had a responsibility to enforce the laws. You stop taking in tariffs and paying federal taxes and whatever, you're breaking the law. And the president has a responsibility to enforce the laws. Don't tell me about secession. It's no nonsense secession. That none would misunderstand his meaning, Douglas asserted that what the country needed was old hickory measures, It's no Andrew Jackson, Tennessean. He said he'd hang anybody. He talked about secession. So there's some books. I'll give you a list. Anybody wants a list? Look at my contacts. You want to deal with guys who just want to go over one little garbage book from propaganda, and then or some internet nonsense. Feel free. You want to study the issue, learn about the issue, I'll give you a list of books to study it. These guys are giving you a bunch of right-wing nonsense from the libertarian angle. Lincoln was a tyrant and Lincoln was a monster and he increased the size of government and and he was this that the other thing and they don't know what they're talking about. All wars increase the size of government. The issue is the war worth it? Was it worth it to keep the Union intact? Which side was morally right? Which side would you have been on? Ask yourself that. I mean, and then of course, Max's view is that no one fights for moral reasons. It's ludicrous. What people fight for moral reasons? Are the money interests involved? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Samuel Butler, a Marine who won 2 Medal of Honors. He said war is a racket. Most wars are. Most wars are. Yeah, people get in wars. We're going here to war and terror for 10 years now. What do you think? That's why you think there's so much resistance for Trump to pull troops out of NATO. NATO. Well, you think the Russians are coming on and invade Europe now? There's money involved. We know that. Afghanistan. You can't pull them out once you get... Why? Because there's money involved. So we understand that. No one questions that. No one questions that people made money off the war. Every war somebody makes money off of. That's just, you need the government expands, your freedoms contract, and people make money off it. People get, goods get, there's a lot of destruction. Taxes have to be raised. The money, or the inflation occurs, or it's a disaster. War's always the last thing you want to do. I think it was Jefferson that says that nothing ever good comes from war. Nothing. But except the fact that there might be a time you have to do it. That's why wars have to be defensive. And war has to be the last result, last thing you appeal to. Because once it's started, you don't know where it's going to end. And you deal with people's lives. So you don't go into it lightly. It's a crisis that basically is the last thing. That's why wars are supposed to be declared by Congress, not being going into the way we've done the last 50 years or whatever. Just go into these things and Congress is involved. Get Congress involved because they represent the American people. The American people have to be supporting, and voting for saying, okay, this is worth it, and we're going to go to the end on this. But when people bring all that stuff in, we understand that. We understand the issue of, people made money off the Civil War. There were moral abuses in the Civil War. There were, both sides. The Union did terrible things. South did terrible things. He brings up the Indians. Of course, terrible things were done to the Indians. What, you think the Confederates weren't going to do terrible things to the Indians? They were going to expand to the West. They had one. They had plans to expand to the West. The Indians weren't going to stop them. So, there's your list. I'm happy to, if everyone wants to ask me for it, I'll give you the names of the books. You can look at the context. I have 1840, 1860, the context going back to 1776. These various issues. Don't get caught up in these weird conspiracies. And that's what this channel is essentially about. This is why I put these things up. I'll go off in these tangents and very things. We talk about other issues. Economic issues, political issues, military issues, because they relate to other things that relate to thinking. And when you go into your Bible, your King James Bible, you have to be able to think. You've got to be able to understand context. You got to understand figures of speech. Something Sluder has no grasp of. That's why you have idiots teaching about Jesus Christ burning in hell for 3 hours and using psalms and things that are talking figuratively. Then you have Ruckman talking about dropping his sins off in hell. What the heck is that? And Jesus Christ paid for the sins of the devil? What? Where do you get this stuff from? Where do they get this stuff from? But when the guy starts off and he can't figure out the Trinity, I gave you a link to one guy, and he was actually a Ruckman guy. He says, you know, he took Sluder to task over this issue. You can't get the Trinity right. You're going to foul. Somewhere you're fouling up everything else. And sure enough, he comes out there, you know, and he talks about Jesus Christ being, and then of course he tries to shift the issue back, trying to say that Ruckman's really defending that view. When Ruckman was dealing with the worm, Jesus Christ became worm. Of course, there's one word about Jesus Christ being dying, and you know, burning, paying for the sins and torments, which was the essential issue. So that clarification video shows how dishonest he is. He gives a thing with the guy talking. He says, "See, I've been vindicated," because Ruckman didn't even correct him, and Ruckman emphasized the issue of burning the Jesus Christ turning into a worm on the cross. But he was on the cross. He didn't go to torments to turn into a worm. And that was the essential issue that Sluder was trying to bring up, and he tries to con you. And you're supposed to be able to pick up the con. But most of these guys don't. Most people listen and they don't hear. They don't want to hear what they don't want to hear. They don't want to see what they don't want to see, and they don't want to hear what they want to hear. That's why their eyes are closed and their ears are shut. You have guys reading the scriptures, and they're saying the opposite of what they're trying to say. And you say, "What are you saying?" And they think they prove their points. No, you haven't proved anything. Breaker does it. Kim does it. Sluder does it. So what's the purpose of these videos? Ed, why do you keep going after these guys? You know, I got this guy, some people saying, "You just don't like anybody. You're with this." First thing I saw, as I said before, this does not change my feelings about Max in one bit. I still love Max in the Lord. He's still a brother in Christ. And so that doesn't change one bit. I know people are thinking, "Oh, like, you know, I'm mad at the guy. I don't like the..." No. I go by the principle of Lincoln: charity towards all, malice towards none. Charity towards all, malice towards none. I don't have malice towards Breaker, or Kim, or Sluder, or Denler. None of these guys I have malice towards. What they're doing is between them and the Lord. I think Denler's a crook. Denler's a crook, no question about it. You know, you can't, you know, tell people you're in full-time ministry and be stealing their money, and you're not in full-time ministry. But that's, you know, he'll get this, you know. I know personal feelings. They say he'll be dealt with. They think I get all worked up. I don't get worked up with these guys. And Max, I feel, is a brother in Christ. You know, he's very sound doctrine. He's still on my channel page. Recommended reading. I'm recommended the channel. So don't be the idea, see, because you have an argument over something that, "Oh yeah, you must hate this guy," or people can't argue anymore without thinking you hate this person. We've lost the ability for discussion in this society. You can disagree with something vehemently, and not be personal. So again, I've got one book here. His Belly to Change is a very good book here. This is about the English and the British issue. If you Brits out there, you want to discuss how, you know, your country ended slavery and the slave trade. It's a very good book on Belly to Change. I almost forgot that. And of course, you read about a book on Wilberforce. Very good. A little battle going on with that issue. You see, with the money issue. You want money. The money issues dealing with slave trade. A lot of money in the slave trade. Still a lot of money in the slave trade. So let me stop, put this up. Amen. Thank you.